Hey, this video is going to talk about sense making a little bit because it's a very popular buzzword on the internet, but not well understood. So first of all, it's important to know that sense making is an academic discipline. It originated with Karl Weick. Karl Weick is, last time I heard, still at University of Michigan as an active professor around the age of 86. He's one of those guys who probably won't ever retire unless he's physically forced to. But Karl Weick started popularizing the sense-making perspective in psychology, especially business and organizational psychology, in the 70s. Although his work goes back even further. He and a number of other folks really reacted to the assumption that social decision-making was rational. And what he really saw directly was that people were telling stories, and that most people make their decisions on the basis of the stories that they receive and give to each other. And that these stories operate under an informal logic. It's more about rhetoric and persuasion, but even more so, what he was talking about was that people don't usually think about reality. They just go about their day, do their tasks, go from thing to thing. And sense making only happens when you're forced to reflect on what's true or real and how to make sense of a particular situation. What happens is that you're put into a situation, and then you have to ask yourself, what's the story here? What's this all about? How did this come to be? Why am I here? Why are people doing what they're doing? And then what we look for is plausible answers to that question. So let me tell you just really quickly about Karl Weick's theory. And again, when I say theory, I must admit that at the technically speaking, it's more of a framework than a theory, because it's a set of ideas that are loosely related to each other that aren't terribly predictive. They're actually more descriptive and explanatory, but they're not very predictive of human behavior. So let me go ahead and repeat for you guys some of the core tenets of sense making. God, where did that go? Okay, here it is. So first of all, Weick identified 7 properties of sense making. The first was that identity and identification is important. Who people think they are in their context shapes what they enact and how they interpret events. Now, this should not be at all surprising. If I think that I am a priest, then the kind of sense I make will be affected by that. You know, so identity matters. Secondly, retrospection. People looking backwards, situations being interrupted, someone suddenly starts thinking, well, what's going on here? So you're always thinking to the recent past to say, well, what just happened? And what's the story? Third, people enact their environments they face in dialogues and narratives. So enactment is core to sense making. Enactment is the idea that things become real because we do them. as people speak and build narrative accounts, it helps them understand what they think, organize their experiences, and control and predict future events, hopefully. But enactment is really all about the assumption that you and I are performing a reality. And that as we are performing it, that we basically are trying to follow scripts or formula of behavior that we are assuming are the right thing to do or the right thing to say. So while we're in the process of taking these enactments, like, hey, I'm a teacher, and in the morning I have my morning routine and I talk to my students, I'm enacting my teacher role. And that in the process of doing that, that means there's an assumed story. There's a story that we assume is going on. And therefore, when things challenge that story, then things get weird and we have to somehow enact solutions that keep the story intact. Okay, number 4 is sense-making is a social activity in that plausible stories are preserved, retained, or shared. So in other words, we're talking about the reenactment of stories. So that's there's a certain sort of uptake that when a story is strengthening, then it gets reshared, reenacted. However, the audience for sense-making includes the speakers themselves. So the narratives are both individual and shared and are an evolving product of conversations with ourselves and our others. So everyone has a chance in human reality to change patterns of reenactment. And so the responsibility lies on all of us to create the story. It's not just leadership. Okay? So reenactment requires everybody. Okay, number 5, sense-making is ongoing in real time, human scale time, which the scale of our understanding of stories, our speech patterns, that scale of human time is where sense-making happens. So individuals simultaneously shape and react to the environments they face at that scale. So there are big picture activities that are at a bigger scale or micro nanosecond things that happen in the world. But the scale of our storytelling is the time scale, and the unit of time scale is the stories that we tell. That's our scale of attention as human beings. Most of our attention is focused on that sense-making scale of time. The near future, the near past, contained within one moment or scenario. Okay? Number 6, people extract cues from the context to help them decide what information is relevant. So everyone's looking for clues or cues. Instead of making sense of the whole story, which is too complicated, or having a complete understanding, we try to cognitively economize by focusing on the specific cues that would help us clarify between story A or story B, or path of action A, path of action B. So let's say, for example, we want to know whether or not Jordan Peterson is a jerk. That's just what we want to know. And we look for cues to let us know whether or not he's leading us on or he's leading us in the wrong direction. And so the kind of story that Jordan Peterson tells on a podcast will give us cues. Are we being duped or not? And those cues are often more important than what the actual action is, or the actual actor is saying or representing. because as it turns out, that's where our attention is focused, and that's how we make our decisions, is on cues. And so if we misread cues or misunderstand cues, or if those cues are themselves manipulative or misleading, we could go down a wrong path really easily. So much depends on the cues. Number 7, people favor plausibility over accuracy in accounts of events and context. Because of how complex knowledge is, people are always looking to radically simplify the amount of work that they need to do to understand it. So not just in terms of extracting cues, but in terms of what's the evaluative process? Are they looking for an optimized truth? No. They're looking for a good enough truth. But they're looking for plausibility. And plausibility comes from stories more than it does from facts. So you can show people the facts all day long, but facts in and of themselves are not necessarily persuading, because they may not fit the story that somebody already thinks that they are enacting. And so it's sort of like, well, right facts, but wrong story, bro. And so they will disregard facts and cues from implausible narratives, okay? Now, again, so these are the 7 basic things that Weick identified that are always the case for sense making in his 1995 book, Sensemaking in Organizations. Now, a lot has been written before and since then that's a lot more specific. And some people will note that his theory of sense making really isn't that different from classic Aristotelian rhetorical perspective. The main thing that Weick did is he tried to focus everything around stories and scenarios and situations, rather than just simply audience and speaker, which was the classic rhetorical perspective. Weick says, well, we're not necessarily just sitting in a debate club, are we? We're not just having a philosophical, rhetorical discussion. Real, live, ongoing action is happening. And the person in the moment saying, hey, what do I do? What do I do? And what story tells me where I go next and what I do next? So that is the core of the Karl Weick sense-making perspective, for those who don't know it. Okay? Now, here's where I want to come in and kind of help people a little bit. So I started working on a paper with Barry Mitnick around 2010. We ended up putting it in a conference in, no, it was around 2011. And it went into a conference in 2012 called the Society for Business Ethics. You know, we got a lot of positive responses to it. But what we noticed was that there were a lot of plot holes in Karl Weick's sense-making theory, because he never really specified what ordinary sense makers are doing in a procedural model that was really complete enough to be predictive. It was mostly just explanatory. Now, what Mitnick and I did is we tried to create a cognitive model that describes the ordinary person's ongoing behavior and judgment. And instead of focusing only on sense making in that model, we focused on meaning making and sense making within the context of a commitment to action. And so in the Mitnick and Ryan model, commitment to action is actually the central concern rather than sense making. Sense making is actually the secondary concern of a social actor. Why? Because it is more important that we know what your actual commitments are to participate in enactment, what your stories are that you've already bought into. That is the most critical piece of information to understand human action, not the sense-making process itself, which is often simply a reinforcement of your prior commitments to action. Okay, so we want to know, how do people form new commitments to action? Because that's the central piece. It's not enough that you make sense. It's that story that you tell from making sense does not translate into action unless a new commitment is made to take action on the basis of such a thing. Otherwise, it just becomes a story. Why is this so important? It's important because many people are misled to think that bad sense making always results in bad action. And this is wrong, because you could make all sorts of wrong judgments with your mouth. You could tell stories, but you're just a storyteller. What are you actually doing? What are the actions you're actually taking? And the commitment to take action tells us more about who you are and about the powerful nature of those stories than merely the revisitation or reenactment of a story. And so let me give you a specific example. So I could say that I am, let's say I'm online and I'm a big supporter of climate change. And the actions that I usually take to support climate change don't actually help the climate. What they actually do is to create verbal conflict with people who I perceive to be on the wrong side of the climate story. So you have a climate story. Remember, this is just a story. We have a story about the climate. Maybe some facts support it, maybe some facts don't, but here's the narrative. If we overly emphasize sense making, then we assume that the action involves either agreeing with the narrative or disagreeing with the narrative. Okay, so Bob agrees with a particular climate change narrative. Sue does not agree with the climate change narrative. Bob and Sue get into a dispute over this. Neither one of them end up actually changing their behaviors in terms of how they positively affect climate change. Instead, they argue with each other. Sense was made. Relevant actions were not taken around the topic by either person. No commitments to real action on the basis of climate change were actually formed. What really happened was that Bob and Sue had commitments to argue with each other. They had commitments to fight. They had commitments to have negative emotions. They had commitments to the stories itself. But they didn't actually have commitment to take action on climate. In which case, you could make sense till you're blue in the face. So, this becomes more obvious when you're in an organizational setting where people tell stories to each other around the water cooler, right? But they don't actually take action on them. And so you can have 80% of people in the office all agreeing on a particular narrative and still not enacting it. What they're enacting is the agreement to participate in the narrative about the narrative. So in other words, their commitments were very shallow. Why does that even matter? It's very common in organizations that you're trying to mobilize action. And to mobilize action, you need people to actually commit to take the necessary actions. And if all you can do is get people to commit to the story, that story does not necessarily trigger action. So, Karl Weick examined this question in a paper in 1995 about smoke jumpers who had not followed the directions of their leader, and there was a big crisis where 18 out of 20 smoke jumpers, I believe it was, I don't have the numbers right on the top of my head, I think it was 18 out of 20 died in the fire that they were trying to put out, because the wildfire took a nasty turn and they weren't properly trained on how to survive it. And one of the only people who was, the leader, was desperately trying to get people to listen to him, but because he didn't have any long-term credibility, because this particular group of smoke jumpers had not worked together with him before. So he was a new leader with no history with the group. They did not prepare properly for the worst. They had not had the right conversations about how to survive if things had reached the worst case. There's something called lighting a backfire. Lighting a backfire is basically burning out an area before the bigger fire gets to it, so that you can actually hide in a smaller fire, and the bigger fire will actually seek better food. And so Dodge created a backfire to survive. And he ran toward a backfire that he had created, and he tried to get all the other smoke jumpers to follow him into the backfire. They thought he was crazy, and so they were all running for their dear lives, and they didn't find a path out. But he survived by using the backfire technique. Now, in the Weick case, he claimed that there was a collapse of sense, of shared sense, that they were no longer smoke jumpers and could no longer act like that, and so they just panicked. And his claim was it was because of weak leadership, not because Dodge was a jerk or whatever. They just didn't have enough time to cohere as a team, communicate as one. Okay, so basically, Barry Mitnick and I challenged that slightly, because what we claim is that Weick's own story doesn't say that the sense-making failed. Weick's own story actually says that the commitments to action were what failed. That's what Weick's story implies. Because they didn't have enough prior commitments to take action, they didn't lose sense. It wasn't a collapse of sense-making. It was a lack of commitment to action. So it's entirely possible that you could make sense of something and still not take action because you don't have the shared commitments. and the smoke jumpers didn't have a shared commitment to work together to save each other's lives using Dodge's techniques, because they had not ever established that commitment. So instead, they formed their own commitments to save their own asses, and that turned into panic. So in Mitnick and Ryan, what we argue is that by adding commitment to action to the model, you get a much more rational, clear-headed explanation of what Weick was trying to say without the magic leap between belief and action, because commitment falls in the middle. Okay? So it should be rather intuitive if that's the case. Now, the problem was when we originally wrote the paper, people didn't really understand what we were trying to say. And that's partially our fault, because we tried to write the paper directly from a common sense, well, let me just argue this for you perspective. But the reviewers just simply, they thought that they needed too much background information to even participate in the conversation that Barry and I were trying to have, because it was a lot of different parts, and we were kind of building a model while also critiquing Weick. So what I'm planning on doing is rewriting that this year and resubmitting it, because I know how to simplify the problem now, which is to focus only on the commitment to action issue rather than to fill out the entire model in detail in the same paper. Unfortunately, you got to break things into little bite-sized pieces in academia. So here's the deal. Let me give you a really quick example of our model. Perception. So we first perceive our environment. Certification. We then go through the process of certifying what objects are. That's a car, that's a chair, that's a table. This is an important cognitive step where we take account of our immediate environment in terms of the verbal or quantitative assumptions we have about what those objects are, object-oriented, you know. And if we get that wrong, things can fall apart too. So perception is just your raw perception. Certification is, what are those things? For example, when I meet a new person, do I certify them as a threatening stranger? Do I certify them as an old man? What do I certify people as? Right? So we make these immediate assumptions and judgments in our intuition. And then after that comes what I call rationication. And rationication is where I dig up whatever models of thought are easily accessible to my mind. And different people prefer different cognitive heuristics. We don't all share the same priorities for them. We have personality differences in what our usual tools are for making decisions. So rationication is where we get into our personal grab bag of tools and we start using our deliberative cognitive mind. And we start saying, well, what the heck is this stuff? What ought I to do on the basis of what I've observed, right? I have these incoming facts. Now, then after that, we have to form a commitment to take action. Now, Barry likes to break rationication into two steps, where he also comes into belief assignment, where he basically says, you know, you have to reflect on the the already held beliefs that you possess and how they match up to your rational tools. Because remember, beliefs are just automatic. For example, it's going to rain on today because I saw the weather, so I believe it's going to rain. So that's an assumption. So what Barry says is basically you have to match your rational tools to your assumptions. And that was another step. But I put them in the same category for now, just to simplify the model, because they kind of happen simultaneously. Your evaluation of belief is more of your system one, and your deliberative process is your system two, happening simultaneously in the ratiocination step. Then we have to form commitments to action, okay? Where we say, not only do I think that a story is plausible, so I'm sorry, ratiocination includes sense making, okay? So it's not like something other than sense making. It's just my terminology for a sense making process that where I don't just reuse Karl Weick's word of sense making. I chose my own words to make it custom for my model. So commitment to action is tricky because that's where you have to really say, I'm either going to take action now or take action later, but I will. Because commitment to action usually involves an if-then condition, which is to say, if the conditions obtain, then I would act. The thing is that people may not know how strong their actual commitments are. Sometimes people make weak commitments but manage to act in the future. Sometimes people tell themselves emotionally that they have a strong commitment, but that's only while they're in a particular emotional state. And when that state passes, then that commitment weakens. So commitment to action is heavily colored by hot cognition, because you can have a false positive or false negative commitment to action based on how hot your cognition was when you made it, and how much that was colored by, the moment, as opposed to some sort of long-term commitment. So anyway, then there's the step of action, and then there's the step of structuration or reenactment, which basically says, I am now going to take my agency and create a structure out of it by reinforcing my beliefs in my brain so that next time I'm in a situation, I know what to do. Now, my story is more clear, my action path is more clear. So it's not enough to have a clarification of the story in the sense-making process. My argument is that you have to clarify your action path within that story, which Karl Weick did not explain in his model. Okay, so perception, certification, ratiocination, you could say belief, evaluation of belief or something like that. Then commitment to action, structuration. And so that's my sequencing. Now, I largely agree with Weick's general approach to sense making, but by proceduralizing it, we can then understand what the various routines are that people go through and where the faults lie, and more importantly, where the commitments are formed, not just where the stories are formed. Okay. So that's the version of the Karl Weick model that I'm developing, centered around the commitment to act. Because sometimes people can buy into stories long before they ever actually elevate that story into an importance in their life where they take action. A large percentage of people are only mildly committed to politics. I mean, they'll tell you if they have a strong emotional commitment to the story, and they'll have a strong emotional commitment to making sense in a certain pattern. But that doesn't necessarily actually mean that they take the political actions implied by the story, such as all the supposed Marxists who are revolutionaries who refuse to take revolutionary action, right? And that a big part of mob behavior involves the escalation of commitment, where basically mobs are moving from a mere story level to an immediate level of action. And the important point here is that if you are a propagandist, your primary job is to get people committed to a story. But if you're a politician, your primary job is to get people who are committed to the story to actually act, to motivate them to the next level of reality. And that there's a lot of good reasons why people won't do that unless they believe everybody else is ready to do it. So there tends to be the most important mechanism for creating political action is the mechanism where you activate someone from belief to action. So going back to why we care about this detail. We live in a world where everything is justified by stories. That's the human world. But we feel as if we are powerless or have very little power on an individual level. But we feel very powerful when we are motivated to take action as a group. Unfortunately, there are very few things in this world that we are willing to drop our routines for. We've got jobs, we've got children, we're all very busy. We're all trying to figure out how to make the most use of the life that we have. So time is, the older we get, especially, time is our most precious commodity. Time and attention. And so people say, well, how should I use my time and how should I focus my attention? And the political actors want you to be so confident in your stories that you're ready to take action whenever the mobilization is required. So when someone calls and you says, you're committed to the cause of women's rights, we are having our march. Can I mobilize? Can I count on you to actually show up? Right. So this is really where the meat of the propaganda industry is. It's trying to get people escalated to the point where they would take action. Classic example is QAnon. And think about how many people were following it as a believer. I think it was several million people by the end were following QAnon as a believer. How many actually took action on it? A few hundred? that actually followed up on the prophecies and actually showed up at the the supposed times and to do the supposed things. And when you have that small of a number of people willing to take action on behalf of a story, when I say willing to take action, I mean willing to follow through with the full narrative, to do what the narrative suggested they ought to do at the end, then we know that it wasn't as dangerous of a propaganda piece as was once thought, because the percentage of commitment to action on it was actually quite low. Meaning that one of two things: the people who believed the story were either too terrified in terms of not believing that there were enough of each other, that they didn't have a big enough safety in numbers to pull off what they wanted to do. And that's just good common sense. A lot of these nut job, cultish, very small radical organizations fail to do this test to see whether or not they have the correct scale of support for what they're trying to do. So that's the scale problem. Is there enough of us? The second biggest issue in trying to move radicals into action, from sense making to action, has to do with so we said fear and scale. The second one is the commitment, which is to say, were they able to see themselves as part of the story or just merely an observer? Did they actually feel like the locus of control on the outcomes fell on them? Or did they feel as if they had bigger problems of their own, right? So there's a lot. So I'm not saying that's a complete list, but I'm trying to shift the conversation here, which is for us to understand not how propaganda works, because that's pretty well understood. All you have to do is go back and read the classic books written by the propagandists themselves, like Edward Bernays. How come nobody is actually going on podcasts and telling people what Edward Bernays wrote about in his own propaganda books? I mean, come on. We don't need people to reinvent that wheel. It's a very well understood problem, is how propaganda works. We also have some knowledge about how social movements escalate people to commitment. Okay? But what we really struggle to understand is not that. We're still trying to understand which stories are healthy, first of all. And second of all, how to get people to commit to healthy stories. And so I'm going to frame this more in a health perspective, that our real concern is not to understand the processes by which sense making occurs, or the processes by which propaganda occurs, or so forth, but it's to say, what are the healthy forms of storytelling? And how do we get people to commit to take action on the basis of healthy stories? Because, setting the word propaganda aside, we live in a matrix of stories. There's nothing outside of that. We live in a matrix of stories, so we can't. It's not about being more rational by trying to see the facts. All facts are embedded in paradigms and narratives. And without those paradigms or narratives, the facts don't do anything for you anyway. So it is very rational for people to turn in narratives. So we need to say, first, what are the healthy narratives? Secondly, how do we know that a narrative is healthy? So let's not worry about critique, let's worry about construction. How do we know that a narrative is healthy? And third, how do we get people to participate in the distributed storytelling and sense making of the healthy narratives without them becoming unhealthy? And then, of course, fourth, my issue, which is how do we get people to then commit to action on the basis of these healthy stories? Now, this is a much more important paradigm for us to be operating in than the collapse of sense making or the crisis of this or the. Now, you guys have done important work to draw attention to problems, but until I start hearing solution talk, you're not helping anybody make sense of nothing. You're only helping people to understand that we need discernment and we need to check our facts and we need to read more books and we need to spend more time thinking critically. Of course we do. Of course we do. Ask any college professor how easy it is to get people to do that just by repeating that over and over again. It's just simply repetitively telling people to try harder to discern is not actually the solution. The solution is to go on about creating healthy narratives, identifying narratives that are healthy, helping people to make sense of that. How we know that they're healthy in the positive, and then helping people to form commitments to take action on the basis of that process, and then reinforcing it. That's what we should be doing. All right. And I can talk to you guys a whole lot more about that. Thank you very much.